Hey YouTube, mDecks Music here, and welcome back as we continue our series on how to write music, decoding Beethoven. So at the end of the last video, we talked about all the different elements involved in that first theme and invited you guys to use those elements and kind of come up with your own version of a classical piece using all the elements we talked about. And we've done the same exact thing, and we're going to share some of those ideas with you in this video. We have 4 different basic ideas that all use all of the elements we talked about, the approach tones, the gruppettos, all that stuff, the arpeggios, and they're all exactly using the same chord progression diatonically that we talked about originally when we were analyzing Beethoven's piece. And there's all these elements that all 4 of them share, and yet they all sound completely different, and we're going to show you how we got there. So our first example is the most true to the original version that we came. It was in the same exact key. Like we said, all of them use the same chord progression, and you see a lot of the arpeggiation that we talked about and approach tones. Sounds like this. So it's probably pretty clear to hear all the similarities between our first iteration of our sonata and how it compares and contrasts, mostly compares, with Beethoven's original. You hear the arpeggiations, you hear all the approach notes, you even hear that half cadence at the end. And like we said earlier, the chord progression is the same. It's the 1, 5, 1, 7, 1, 2, the sus chord, and the half cadence at the end. All those elements are exactly the same as far as the diatonic chord progressions. It's in the same key, it's in cut time, and we just kind of rearranged some of the approach methods we use and incorporated some approach tones where they weren't before, and it's kind of put our own spin on it, and it's made it our own song. Derivative, yes, but that's kind of the whole point of this, is try to emulate this style and get it to sound exactly like it so that you can do whatever you want with it later on. So let's get into the second evolution of our theme that sounds like this. So in our second example, you can probably maybe notice right away it's in a completely different key. So we've gone from our original F minor and we transposed everything over to D minor. So that's one main difference between the first example and the second example. It's still in cut time, it still follows diatonically the same chord progression, we're just now in a different key. So in the map, we have D minor, A7, D minor, but it's still 1, 5, 6, 5, 1. Remember, that's never going to change. Also, the fact that there's 2 strong beats in every measure will also never change. So something else that's also different is the rhythm. What this incorporation of syncopation has also sort of done is simplified the rhythm we're using with the approach notes, and it's also kind of changed what type of approaches we're using. All the approaches in this example are diatonic, whereas in the other example they were chromatic for the most part. So to really understand the sequencing of that second example we just listened to and played for you guys, you really have to kind of like hone in on measure 2. So measure 2 may have been written pretty organically. We just kind of, we knew we wanted to go and incorporate some approach tones. And those are the approach tones we came up with. But what's going on in measure 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and that whole sequence that occurs there is all predicated on that and what we did there. And what we did there was use notes from the D minor scale. We used diatonic approach tones. Like I said, I may have not intended to do that, but once it's there, you gotta see, okay, those are all diatonic approach tones. That means when I get to measure, what is that, 4, I gotta do the same thing. Those approach tones are also diatonic, and the sequence that occurs after that is all diatonic approach tones. Very different from what we did in the first example, because what we did in the first example was use an approach tone from above and below, something called trapping. So we trapped our target note with two approach tones, one from above, one from below, and the one from above was diatonic, but the one from below was chromatic. So while examples 1 and 2 both use not only sequencing, but the same exact sequence, the way we treated the approach tones were a little different. And this is pretty clear when you look at the second measure. So in example 2, we had this diatonic sort of approach sequence. But in measure 2 of number 1, we have this trapping sort of technique we're using. So we're trapping our target note by approaching it from an approach note that's above that target note and below. And the one that's above is diatonic, and the one that's below is chromatic. So in trapping your target in this way of using the diatonic note above your target and taking a chromatic approach from below the target, it's important to keep in mind the scale that we're using, that all this comes from. Because if we're going to be talking about diatonic approaches, it's important to know, well, what's diatonically in this scale, in F harmonic minor or C Mixolydian flat 9, flat 13. So moving forward, keep that in mind, because in this second measure right here, what we have is what appears to be something that is exclusively chromatic. I go from a C up to a D flat, and then I approach the C again from a half step below. The reason it's not is because D flat is in the scale I just played. So it's kind of an overlap. It's kind of a coincidence, right? That's a consequence of the scale, that where we happen to be is exclusively sort of half-step approaches, right? Well, let's look at the next measure. Maybe it'll become more clear there. So as we get to measure 4, we have E, F, D sharp, and E. Once again, by virtue of where we've landed in the scale, they're exclusively half steps. But F is diatonic because it's in the scale. So if we take it a step further, look at the next measure. This is where it becomes a bit more clear that the note we're using above, our above trap note, is diatonic. And we still have that half step approach below. And then the next measure, sorry. All right, so once again, we've landed in that area of the scale where there's a half step. So it may appear that we're just using chromatic approaches the whole time through, but we're not. All right, and in the next measure, that B flat is a diatonic note. So I guess basically how you perceive the first measure, whether it's a diatonic approach from above and a chromatic approach from below, doesn't really become clear to you until you see the fifth measure. So how to sequence is really important, and understanding what you intend to do as you sequence comes from an understanding of the scale and what you're doing inside the box versus outside the box. We've talked about over and over again, if you want to do stuff outside the box, you got to know what's inside the box. So if you're going to sequence a theme and you're not going to stay true to it, it should be on purpose. If you're going to go from diatonic above to chromatic below and then switch it from exclusively chromatic and then jump around, it should be on purpose. It shouldn't be by accident, so to speak, right? So it may seem like we're spending a lot of time on these approach tones and talking about them and the sequencing involved with these approach tones and how these approach tones show up in the sequencing, but they're vital elements and vital characteristics of what makes Beethoven sound like Beethoven. More so than the melody and the harmony, what's going on with these sequences and the approaches used within these sequences are crucial. So it's really important to understand how to use them correctly, and if you're going to use them incorrectly, to be doing so on purpose, right? So having said that, let's move into our third example, which ventures even further away from the original, not only Beethoven example, but our first example also.